support of this fall series. That means all 4 webinars that happen on a monthly basis, starting this month through December, will be funded through the generous support of the Virginia Foundation for Humanities. And the theme that we're looking at is broadly transforming or healing historical harms. And one of the ways we're going to try to feature this series is not only with our various expert guest speakers coming on each month to speak on the different subject matter that you'll see some more about later, but also we'll be looking at some case studies that happen here in Virginia, coming from the Virginia state. And we'll look at some of the case studies coming out of the work that's being done here. It's really my pleasure to start this fall series off with Dr. David Anderson Hooker as our guest speaker. And he'll be addressing the subject matter of transformative community conferencing based on a recent publication of a little book, which is part of the series of the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And so this book just came out in 2016, I believe. But let me say a little bit about David. David's not only a good colleague and friend, but a well-known voice and presence in the field. And David Anderson Hooker is currently Professor of Practice of Conflict Transformation and Peace Building at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame's School of Global Affairs. His practice spans more than 30 years as a mediator, trainer, leadership development specialist, advocate, and community peace builder, working in multiple regions of the world, which you can see there, including a lot of work here at home with our issues of racial justice and other issues. He is the co-author of a, I think, groundbreaking manual at the time called Transforming Historical Harms, that was a project of the Coming to the Table program and Eastern Mennonite University Center for Justice and Peace Building. And we will be hearing from representatives speaking to us about the Coming to the Table in the November webinar. And then, as I said, most recently, David Anderson Hooker has put together a lot of his practice and experience in this book on transformative community conference, and we wanted to showcase that briefly for this webinar. There will be other opportunities to engage with David in training around this, and we'll get to those in the announcements that come. So, David, thank you for being with us. Thank you for giving of your time, and we look forward to the conversation before us. It's over to you.
Thank you. So, good evening. Thank you all. Good afternoon. I don't know what time zone you all are in. Thank you all for joining. Carl, Patience, Kajungo, thank you all for organizing this and inviting me. I know that we've got more than we can say grace over in the period that we have, and so I just want to go ahead and jump right in, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. And what I'd like to do, let's see, are we sharing my screen now? Or no?
Yes, we see your screen. Just if you'll put it on, go ahead and put it on presentation slideshow mode.
Yes, exactly. All right, here we go. So I'm going to just jump right in, do some conversation about this process and both the theory and the practice associated with transformative community conferencing, and then I really look forward to the questions that will emerge out of it. What I imagine I would like to do is talk just a little bit about the origin of it, how I got to this framing of transformative community conferencing, a little bit of conversation about the foundations, because I think they're important, they're valuable to help understand some of the practices. They're not necessary in order to do the practice, but they're helpful to understanding kind of the power of the practice. And then let's lean into what the steps are, what each of the steps are, and then spend some time questions and wrestling. Carl, what I'd love to do is in between the theory piece and the practice, have maybe 2 or 3 minutes. If there are questions that are about understanding of the theoretical piece, I'd love to entertain some of those. If there are questions challenging it, let's hold on to those till the end so you can hear the whole thing together. But if there are questions about just simple clarification or understanding, let's spend a couple of minutes between the transition of theory to practice to look at those, if that works.
That would be perfect, David. And just to remind the participants who are on, who may not be as familiar with Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of icons. One of them is Q&A. Click on that and type in your question, and I'll be monitoring that as we go.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's look at it. Let's begin first with a sense of my understanding of kind of how this thing works. Peter Block, somebody I've studied with and a colleague, I consider a colleague, describes this idea. He says communities are fundamentally interdependent human systems, I think all life systems, but he says human systems, given form by conversations it holds with itself. The history, building, economy, infrastructure, culture are products of the conversations. And that's really important. So I'm going to be focusing, and I think the Transformative Community Conferencing focuses on the notion of narrative. It's the narrative that we're trying to get at. And so I want to focus on how we unveil the narratives that are shaping our experience and that are impeding us from having equitable, just, harmonious relationships. What I need to make sure we get is that talking about narrative, at least in my mind, is not a rejection of systems analysis or cultural analysis. In fact, it is a infusing of systems analysis and cultural analysis, following somebody like Michel Foucault, who would say that you can't understand the way that systems work unless you understand the narratives that give meaning to them. So the systems only operate in the form that they do because of the narratives that are shaping the society and the culture. And so my conversation, if I don't talk about systems, I'm still talking about systems. If I don't mention culture, I'm still talking about culture. And so I hope you'll hear it that way. Real quick note about how I got to Transformative Community Conferencing. I started off a lot of my work a long time ago, many, many years ago, first with a group called the National Coalition Building Institute. Some of you may be familiar with Sherry Brown's work at NCBI and how we take notice of how to make sure that all issues, all people's issues matter and can be considered. And so a lot of NCBI's work became kind of foundational or at least informative for the way that I work. Got great skill set at systems analysis and structural analysis by working with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. If you've never done an Undoing Racism workshop or an advanced Undoing Racism workshop with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, it will do you good regardless of what the nature of your practice is. I want to encourage that. I spent a bit of time working with the Kellogg Foundation, supporting the William Winter Institute in what was called a decade of dialogue to end racism in Mississippi. I have no idea why we thought we could do that in a decade. Mississippi was constructed around the entire notion of racism, and so to pull back all of the walls actually to raise the foundation of Mississippi would have been necessary to end racism, but at least to begin the conversation. And even coming to the table, so at least in NCBI, the People's Institute, the Decade of Dialogue, I recognize that a lot of the dialogue work we were doing either talked about structure or relationships, but rarely about the two at the same time. And we thought we had begun some of that work and begun trying to address that in the Coming to the Table project. Many of you don't know that the early acronym for TABLE was Taking America Beyond the Legacy of Enslavement. We've kind of dropped that conversation a bit for a variety of reasons, but that was the initial work, was coming out of strategies for trauma awareness and resilience and figuring out how to take America beyond the legacy of enslavement. It was near the end of the Coming to the Table project that we were writing the manual that became known as Transforming Historical Harms, which I thought was a really, really important work, really valuable work. And we looked at these four quadrants: use of we said narrative for history, connection, healing, and action. And it wasn't until I got near the end of writing the manual, and Amy, who was doing a great job, Amy Potter, who was doing a great job of kind of managing that process and saying, David, we need the manual, we need the manual. I realized what I was actually supposed to be talking about. We had been saying the use of narrative for history and healing and connection and action, but in fact, we only were talking about story. We weren't talking fully about narrative, and I want to make that distinction in just a little bit, but we were talking really about stories. And there's a distinction between the individual stories that we tell and the narratives that guide our lives. And so what I had to do, Amy said, David, we got to have the manual. We got to have the manual. I was like, no. She took it from me. And so my response, which is what, only reasonable response that I could think of, was to go and get a PhD and critique my Transforming Historical Harms manual by doing a PhD where I explained what I had failed to understand in Transforming Historical Harm. Let me say this. I think Transforming Historical Harms is great work. And there's more work, there's more depth in it. And so I went off and wrote this PhD project where we really investigated narrative and not just story. And it was a lot of fun. And that was the beginning of the transformative community conferencing work. So that work comes out of a theoretical framework. So this transformative community conferencing work comes out of a particular theoretical framework. I'm just buzzing through it real quick. I know that some of it may slip past. It's not even a full primer on social construction, but there are a couple of general principles that we operate in. One is that knowledge is sustained through social processes. What people know, what people believe that they know, the way that we operate around what's reality is really something that is only sustained through the way that we relate in micro and macro ways with one another. There is nothing essential about the individual. There's nothing about race or gender or ethnicity or sexuality that characterizes, or that is essential, that actually exists in an unalterable way. There are more ways of knowing, and so nothing is essential. So it takes an anti-essentialist framework. We believe that knowledge doesn't actually reflect direct perception. It is more of a representation, and it's not even a full representation of reality. It's an interpretive representation of reality. And that language is very much how we both sustain that knowledge and think about it. So it's a precondition of thought, so our language will matter. Nothing is inherently true. That's not to suggest that nothing is real, that nothing exists, but it's not inherently true. Like there's not a meaning attached to it before we give it meaning. The thing itself may exist in phenomenon form. It is meanings that we give to it that establish it. And then if we organize our life around a particular meaning, that's what gives it a sense of truth. In addition to those four primary frameworks or underpinnings of social construction, from my understanding of trauma, I also would suggest that traumagenic circumstances and events impact the meaning-making process. So all of our knowledge, all of our language, our perceptions are shaped and shifted through traumagenic circumstances and events. And then the narratives that we build, those narratives are what frame systems, structures, policies, procedures, and relational patterns, which is how our societies are organized. And so it is the narratives that we need to be able to know about. And if we're trying to shift systems, structures, policies, or procedures, we have to be willing to construct counter narratives and live into the counter narratives as a way of deconstructing or changing the trajectory of the dominant narratives in our communities. We exist and we have identities through the form of narrative. And I do want to make this one quick distinction between a story, which is an individual kind of representation or individual instance of a particular framing, and narrative, which is interweaving of multiple stories. It's usually a type of story that's told over and over again, so it develops an archetypal format. And so if you think about it, something like the hero's journey is a narrative. There is an unlikely hero that takes off on a quest. They usually find some resource, either a guru or a scripture or some team of people, and they go off on a quest. They have some failings, they have some victories. Ultimately, they return home changed. That's the shape of a hero's narrative. And there are a bunch of heroes' narratives that we're very familiar with. We're familiar with things like The Lord of the Rings or The Hunger Games or The Little Engine That Could. These are all heroes' narratives, right? And there are stories, individual stories that fit inside of those narratives. It's the narrative, those broad narratives that guide our behavior, our emotional understanding, our relational patterns and practices, and the way that we understand systems and structures in the world. So it's transforming those community narratives that is the way forward to transform conditions in community. At least that's my assertion, and I'd love to test it with you. Our identities, we have multiple identities. Sometimes we think we have this primary sense of self that's formed by the kind of interweaving of a variety of identity or relational identity aspects to ourselves. You know, some of those personal, social identities, there's a bunch of categories of them. We tend to think in this way that there's a core identity. You know, there's primarily the way that people see us, and then there's some secondary and peripheral sense of ourself. But it's really better, I think it's more valuable or helpful to think about it as a valence of identities, where in the immediate context, one or more of these aspects of ourselves in the immediate context comes to the fore. And then other parts of us, our personal experience, some cultural histories, educational framing, any other aspects of ourselves, those are circling around. And thinking about this valence notion, it's kind of like atomic structure, where there are charged particles, electrons, neutrons, protons, if you remember your basic kind of chemistry. And when some of them are negatively charged, some of them are positively charged, and the situation or the context will make one of these identities come to the fore, make it more attractive. So we're better able to understand a particular circumstance through a gender lens at certain points, or through a racial or cultural lens at other points. Or it may be that the audience itself shapes how we understand and perceive what's going on. And so it's a valence of identities is a way of thinking about how this works. And so it's even more fluid than the notion of intersection. And the way that we show up in community is through our living of these identity narratives. We have personal stories. Those personal stories help to shape our sense of identity, but those personal stories are undergirded, are shaped by, and they exist in a container of localized narrative and discourse around different aspects of our identity. I am flying through what should normally be an entire semester, probably a degree's worth of consideration, but hopefully it's not too fast that you don't get it. Raise questions if you don't. But that sense of identity, the personal stories as they relate to and as they are shaped by and contained within narrative and discourse, give us a sense of identity that determines whether we belong or whether we exist on the margins. And so those margins, those communities, our experience of community then is shaped, formed, sustained through relations of power. So each of our identity, each of the narratives of identity that we have are part of different relations of power. And that power shapes our experience. Foucault is known to say, people quote him as saying, knowledge is power. What he actually says is knowledge is the manifestation of power. What we know about our existence, what we experience to be truth, not truth, is based on a set of a complex interweaving of multiple relations of power. And so our knowledge is based on the manifestations of power, and shaping that power, reshaping that power is what allows us to reshape the existence and the experience in communities to create a sense of belonging and less of a sense of othering within communities. And so that's the work, that's the nature of the transformative community conferencing process. And so that was a really quick run through of some theoretical constructs that will help to undergird what we're doing. Carl, if there are any quick questions for understanding, I'd love to take those before I dash really quickly into the next piece.
Sorry, I'm not seeing any questions right now. Just one question to say, would this presentation be available to folks who have come in or not?
Sure, we'll figure out a way to get it to you.
Okay, we could possibly post it if you're open. Yeah, all right.
We could look at that.
Otherwise, I think it's ready to go on.
Cool, all right, let's go, let's run.
But perfect. I invite the participants, jump in. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible, and I'll keep track of the Q&A.
Perfect. Here we go. So let's understand what makes it transformative community and conferencing. So it's transformative as opposed to being restorative or reconciling. While it certainly has influence and it's informed by restorative justice principles to some extent, there is certainly in many communities, there's no history of a thing to be restored. And often restorative justice asks this question of either what rule or law was broken, which what harm was done. And harm in and of itself is often shaped by people's perceptions. And so in order to invite people into a space where they get to be, where they acknowledge themselves as contributing to the harm, is often challenging in community contexts that have been running over an extended period of time, just almost out of habit. People have been born into ways of being, and so they don't necessarily know themselves to be harm or harming. And so sometimes the restorative question gets to be challenging. So it's not that it's not restorative, but it's in some ways we're moving beyond restorative, and it's certainly not necessarily reconciling. Reconciling may come at the end, and that's exciting if it does. That's hopeful. But we're trying to move to a community in which everybody experiences a sense of justice, equity, and a full shared space where they have full citizenship, not in the localized way of having papers and a nationalistic understanding of citizen, but in the notion of member of community, a full communal membership. So that's what we're moving towards, and that may reflect reconciliation. More likely what it reflects is a reconstruction of identities, not being reconnected in our current state, but reconstructing identities to allow us to all move forward together. It's about inviting many voices from the community, and it's not necessarily dialogue or circle, it's a conferencing process. So it draws from some of like David Denborough's work or Winslade and Monk, some of their narrative conferencing approaches to the work. So it's transformative, it's community, it's conferencing, and it's listening, and I want to emphasize this one piece, it's listening for problematics, not for problems. This is a distinction that is really helpful to make, I think. Problems are generally understood in what John Paul would describe them as math and not chemistry. Like problems are things that can be solved. There's an equation associated with it and we're looking for an answer. Problematics are things that have multiple nuances. There are ins and outs. They're more in the line of kind of the Bob Williams forming of wicked problems, where there's no actual solution. There are just a bunch of possibilities of ways forward. And so it's not that the thing can't be addressed, but it usually can't just be resolved. And so we're looking at problematics and not problems, right? And listening for those. That's what makes it transformative community conferencing.
David.
Yes.
Are you interested in a question? There's a few coming in now.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Setu Nair just put in two that are related. Is there room in the TCC to weave in political and economic impact? What's being said there, I think, this participant saying, how does economy impact community and the narratives, etc.? So where do you bring the economics?
So trust me, I'm headed to that. That is really important, and it's absolutely there. So, okay.
Okay,
Go
good.
ahead.
And thank you. And then Erica, a question: what do you mean with conference, not dialogue? Dialogue is not always circular.
Right. So much of the dialogue process, many of the dialogue processes, one of the hallmarks of dialogue processes is that people come in not to change, but to be understood. You know, you come to a dialogue, you come to a circle, and there are a lot of principles, you know, Parker Palmer's touchstones. We're not coming to fix, set straight, correct anyone, or the Public Conversations Project has a set of principles that say that our intention is not to change your mind, but to have you know more about what the other is doing and experiencing. And that's interesting and that's important. At some point though, and there's space for dialogue. It's not that this is an exclusionary process. There's space for dialogue, and there probably are some moments even within a transformative community conferencing where dialogue might be a component, a certain form of story sharing. But it's not, I don't want people to come in believing that our intention is to have everybody go out the same, because that's not the intention. The intention is not to have everybody just come in, know a little bit more about one another, and leave in the same direction. Our intention is to leave in a changed direction, and that is often not a principle that is a foundational principle for dialogue.
Thank you, David. And Phoebe here, and I think you're getting to this, but you can say something if you'd like to comment. Can you explain more about conferencing as compared to dialogue or circle, which you spoke to a little bit just now? What does it look like when people conference in the TCC model? I think.
Yeah. So let's move into the steps and see if at the end of it, if that question still shows up.
Great.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Perfect. So community and culture are both of these are best thought about as practices held in place by narratives. And those narratives are shot through with a certain power or line of force. And so if you're trying to change them, I think it's Jill Deleuze that talks about this idea that, you know, you're on an already and always available trajectory, and you know, this line of force. That's actually Derrida or Deleuze that talks about the line of force. And the idea is, how do you disrupt or shift that? And so that's the design of the process, is to begin to shift those lines of force, right? I don't have time for this. I would love to tell you all a story. If we have time at the end, I'll tell you all a story about the Atlanta Botanical Gardens and how narrative and the role of narrative, force, and violence in shaping the trajectory that people's lives, or the experience that people have in their lives. That picture is a particular picture of the entrance to the sculpting part of the Atlanta Botanical Gardens, where I got an incredible epiphany there. But just trust me that there's a way in which narratives, cultural narratives, force and violence are used to shape the way that people show up in the world. And narrative, force, violence, and complicity are ways of maintaining the structure, even oppressive structures in a society. Often we participate in those unconsciously or with some level of conscious regard or conscious disregard. So we may come back to that. But we want to look at the steps of transformative community conferencing. There are 4 or 5 basic steps. First, we're externalizing the conversation. We'll talk about what that means. We map the problematics. To the extent possible, we create space to do story sharing around kind of the impact of these dominant narratives that we've unveiled. And then we do some reverse mapping, which is to begin to look for unique alternative outcomes, do some story sharing around that. We look at the dominant narratives and alternative narratives that are existing, that are shaping our experience in community. We lay them side by side and invite the participants to choose a preferred narrative. And then based on their choice, we build a transformative action agenda. So let's look at each of those steps. What does it look like to externalize a conversation? We start with this mantra: the people aren't the problem. The problem is the problem. How do we name the problem? The people aren't the problem. The problem is the problem. How do we name it? So I usually like to begin with something that's like a third thing. Parker Palmer would call it a third thing. We use music or, theater or a movie or poem or something, some art form or something that people can look at that's distant from them, but that everybody can look at it and begin to offer interpretations into how it's working, how the narrative or the interpretation of that third thing is occurring. And we do that for practice so that then we can move into an analysis of our own community. So if you go to a play together, you go to theater together, and then you invite the people to do some analysis of what were the problematics that were expressed in the play, and how were those things shaped, and what were some of the alternatives. It's a good practice for people to see it outside because they're much more able to see in theater or a movie or in someone else's narrative how performance is happening. We don't recognize that we are also performing our roles in our communities. But once we've seen it outside, then we can start to notice that there's also a backstory, there's an underlying story, there's a plot, there is a way that lighting and sound shapes our own performance in our own communities. And so once we've done this practice a little bit with a third thing, then we come into a conversation about our own community. And this is just a technical thing that I do. This looks really technical in case you can't tell. That is technology at its finest. This is old school technology. But if you just take a large sheet of paper, you draw something in the middle, draw a circle in the middle. The people aren't the problem is the problem. And you ask people to name the problem. And so they start naming things like fear and ignorance, insecurity, mistrust, duplicitousness. And then you ask, what happens when fear and ignorance are in place in a relationship? What happens? And then they'll start noticing that in their community, it looks like separation or silos or poor communication. They'll notice, and so you're mapping the way that these problematics have impact on life. This is just a very early mapping, because what happens is if you take this map and you talk about the experience of apathy and the role of economics, and you notice that that produces a certain level of invisibility among certain groups, and there's a silencing of those who try to resist, there's a lack of political engagement. And so you're mapping, this is the mapping process. So you're mapping kind of a dominant narrative of what's happening in the community, and you're inviting it. And so it's different from a dialogue process in the sense that it's a intensely facilitated model. You're asking the question, people aren't the problem is the problem. How do you name the problematic? And you invite them to name it and then say, what does that look like? And then they might even say, how does that impact you, not just in the larger community, but in what way does this fear shape your personal relationships, your relationships at work? How does this level of mistrust or sense of apathy shape your relationship with your family, with your co-workers, in your community? And so you really start mapping it so that people can have a deep sense of the impact that these problematics are having on their lives. And then you do some story sharing and allow them to deepen it and deepen. This is what it looks like for me when fear and resignation show up and I see you in the grocery store. This is what it looks like for me when apathy and my ignorance or misinformation, or this is how my living in a silo impacts my ability to relate. And so we do some deep story sharing. And it's really important, to the extent possible, to draw people from different quarters, different sections of the community, so that their stories aren't all affirming the same set of experiences. I remember in Greensboro, we were talking about this and had active members of the police force, some mothers and grandmothers, some members of the movement for Black Lives, some members of the Latin Kings and Queens, and one talked about fear. And the police officer says, when I'm afraid, or when the police officers have a sense of fear, what we do is we surveil more. We will surveil more, and we will we will more quickly resort to force. What the mothers and grandmothers were saying was, when we know that you're surveilling us more, we try to keep our children and grandchildren away from you, which means we encourage them to not relate to you and mistrust you. And then the children say, and we avoid you. And then the police say, well, when you avoid us, then that raises our suspicion, which raises our fear, which means we will surveil you more. We're more quickly. And so they started being able to notice together the spiraling. And the question was not, how do you get rid of the Latin Kings and Queens? How do you undo the movement for Black lives? How do you reform the police? The question was, how do you diminish the fear that exists in our society so that we can together dial this spiral back? But that's something that happens in the story sharing process. And so you have the mapping and then the story sharing. And then after you've had a deep appreciation of the way it's impacting your life, you move to the reverse mapping. And yeah.
Can I jump in here?
Yep.
Just a quick question I think would be nice just to answer as you're getting into the storytelling, because it has to do with trauma.
Sure.
Amy says here, is there a thought that goes into preparing for TCC that addresses how people have stored their trauma narrative in their bodies? In other words, is there a grounding practice to stabilize the nervous system, the brain, that allows people to distance themselves from the lived connections to the narrative?
So, yes, and part of the story sharing process isn't just generic. So I say story sharing there, and there are multiple methodologies for story sharing. And so this is where the implementation of the transformative community conferencing process can be refined in different ways. What we do, like you're looking at this picture right here. I don't know if you recognize this guy. That's an EMU grad. That's John Katunga. But one of the practices that we were doing while we were sharing stories that are trauma-based stories is there's also a tremendous amount of movement. And so as we're processing them, we're also doing some other movement-based work to allow people to shake free and do some other stuff. And so there are a number of different models of story sharing that can be incorporated in those phases to account for the embodied and to allow people to be aware of the embodied connection with their to their trauma narratives. And so there are multiple ways to do that. Yeah.
So facilitators that may be comfortable with various means of working with trauma storytelling could insert that at this place.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what you want them to do, is different. And people have different approaches, different, embodied approaches and different other ways of accounting for that. And so it's not that there is a specific story sharing model, but it's in those moments in the process that we want to be able to do exactly that, to insert a variety of different ways of engaging the traumagenic nature of those narratives.
Great, thank you.
So I was thinking about this externalizing conversations and the process of story sharing, and I allowed my imagination to run, and I wondered, what would an externalizing conversation, what might be the centerpiece for an externalizing conversation between folks who were expressing a variety of different opinions, like in Charlottesville not too long ago. And this is a possibility. It certainly isn't, I haven't tested it yet. I've been doing some work with a few people to have the possibility of testing out this conversation. But when we say that people aren't the problem is the problem. One of the problematics that is expressed in the narrative of those who embraced at least what seem to be two polar perspectives, those who operate from the movement for Black Lives and a variety of their allies, and those who operate from the perspective of honoring, supporting the Confederacy, even those that are supporting a sense of nationalism and what some would say kind of a narrow and rigid form of whiteness as nationality. And what I get is that each of them was expressing a sense of precarity. The notion that the way that the world is moving, there may not be a place for me. It is not clear that the future that you have envisioned allows a space for me. So I may not personally want to accept, I in fact fully reject the approach or even the narrative that came out of much of the nationalist sentiment, but I recognize that much of it was being expressed around, you know, the chant, "You will not replace us," is a sense of threat. Now I recognize, I also think that it comes from a place of unresolved trauma. There's this totalizing hegemonic notion, a particular discourse around whiteness that makes the possibility of whiteness easily threatened, a certain political whiteness easily threatened, and so this was an expression of that. But there's also a precarity associated with young Black lives and older Black lives. And so if we could notice how precarity is the thing that is driving some of our interactions, then it's possible that as opposed to finding a shared vision of a future that we agree on, we could at least as an initial step find a vision of a shared future, which is to say that the future that we have doesn't eliminate some aspects of your authentic self being fully expressed. Some of your, you know, speaking from places of trauma and stuff like that, we're gonna have to work on. But there is a way in which to engage these conversations. I think that precarity may in fact be one of the problems that sits at the middle for people who would reject either the movement for Black Lives or the movement that's now euphemistically described as the alt-right, kind of in their polite ways of characterizing them. But moving, if we take this mapping, these are the problems. This is the dominant narrative. This is what it looks like. People aren't the problem is the problem. This is how it shows up. And then we do some story sharing around it. What those two enable us to do is to move into a really powerful power analysis, a Foucauldian power analysis in the way Michel Foucault talks about power. And so we get these unique stories presented in a shared context, and we allow that story synthesis to emerge. Let me talk a little bit more about that, but let me look at this. Oh, I had a, no. I was supposed to have something about power analysis. So anyway, let me say this without the slide. Michel Foucault, talking about power, every relationship is a relationship of power, and communities are established, cultures exist as an interweaving of the nations of relations of power. And so what this power analysis is, it lets us look at how our communities divide us, how privileges and statuses are distributed according to certain categories and ways of experiencing the world. It allows us to notice where economics and employment and other resources and media resources, narrative, force, violence are used, economic violence, economic force, economic coercion, and economic status and privileges are used to shape a cultural hierarchy. And we have to be able to see that. And usually, because in a lot of deeply divided communities, they live in segregated and siloed lives without the experience of both the collective mapping and the story sharing, you'll not be able to see from another's perspective how your day-to-day conveyor belt living is impacting or interpreted by them. And so it's really important to be able to do the mapping, to do the story sharing in a way that allows us to understand the localized dividing practices, the nature of force and violence that's used to maintain those cultural hierarchies. And so that's where we get a chance to look at economies. And then we do the same thing in reverse mapping. Reverse mapping is to say, not everything that happens in this community is the bad, dominant, oppressive stuff. There's alternative things that are happening. How do you name those? And when you highlight the outliers and the unique outcomes, and then you can say, well, what makes those possible? And we start doing reverse mapping. And so you start from the outside of the circle and you go in. And then you can say, okay, in this community, there are these at least two narratives happening. One may be more dominant than the other, but there are two narratives happening. There's one that's run by fear and apathy and resignation that produces siloed space. And we talk about and synthesize how that is impacting every sphere of our lives. But then we also say, but in this same community, there are clear examples where people take time for one another, where people elevate friendship and relationship over economics, where there's created space for grace. And so we notice that there are these at least two distinct narratives that are happening in the community. And then it's really important to place the dominant narrative next to this synthesized or counter narrative, to create time to recognize that both are present in the current context, and then invite a choice. You always have to invite a choice. You want to reinforce the power to choose a preferred narrative, a preferred trajectory for the community. If we live our lives in stories, we have to organize our stories in ways, organize our lives in ways that support a narrative that we choose to live into. And that's always a choice. And so we have to reinforce not just the power to choose, but the necessity to choose, because without choosing, the dominant narrative will invite you to be regular, to be conformed to the thing that there is. And so whether you want to contribute to it or not, we contribute to sustaining the thing that is, even as we complain and rail against it. We have to make a choice. And then we sit with the fact that that choice is always present before requiring, once we've made a choice, the planning in support of whatever choice is made. I always like to think about, when I think about the fact that the choice is always present, I love the idea of the ruby slippers. You just have to decide. There's no place like home. We just gotta go. The choice has always been there with you. That's what they told Dorothy. After all those years riding on the road, the choice has always been there with you. Just decide to go home. And when you decide, then you make a plan. And that plan requires commitment, a shift in relationships, clear restructuring of how resources are distributed and understood. It calls for, it invites structural change, and it's an invitation to integrity. Like, when we decide that we're going to be in a certain kind of relationship, then I need to give you permission to tell me when the way that I'm showing up in community doesn't reinforce this alternative narrative that we're trying to recreate. The narratives we live into are simply a habit. They are practices. It's a pattern that we form, and you never break a habit. You only replace a habit. And so relationships, the distribution of resources, our relationship to structures is habitual. When structures and systems are oppressive, initially when you're going to change them, you're going to bump up against them. And if you're not willing to be uncomfortable, not willing to be bruised, not willing to be inconvenienced or inconvenience others, then you're not likely to transform your communities. And so you just have to decide, because comfort, some people are comfortable knowing one another, but they're not comfortable advocating for change, particularly when it puts their own comfort and reputations and levels of engagement on the line. And so we have to invite a level of integrity. And then what I'm suggesting is that this transforming community, moving towards equity, it's with this ideas. Our plans are going to be to reshape our entire identities, because our identities will determine how we show up in the world, how we relate to systems and structures and one another. And so those identities have to be relationally constructed, authentic, dignified, interconnected, affirming, legitimated, and we can measure that by them becoming performatively co-equal. And remember, when you're doing it at every stage along the way, if you've done this work, I want to encourage you to stop and celebrate the work. It is not easy work. We are in the process of transforming our understanding of humanity. And so we are narrating our way into Humanity 3.0. I hope you all will be willing to join me in that process. With the little bit of time we have left, questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, if any.
Thank you, David. Fantastic. There are some questions here, so I'm just going to start us right off.
Carl, are you talking right now?
Yeah. Am I
talking? I'm not hearing you at all.
Okay.
You are muted, Carl.
Carl, are you talking?
Now I'm talking. Can you hear me? Did you mute yourself?
I can't hear you. Uh-oh.
How can I hear you, Carl? I think.
Yeah, but David
just developed a technical difficulty. I can no longer hear you.
Okay.
Doctor, can you hear me? Dr. Hook?
Can you hear Kagungu?
I think it will be his computer's problem.
Let's see. No, not yet. Keep talking.
Okay, the participants are indicating they can hear both of us, so it must be something on your computer.
Are you still talking?
I am talking right now.
Are you still talking?
I am. There's something up here.
Just that quickly. Hello? Are you there?
Yes.
Perfect. Finally, I got it. Okay, great. Sorry.
Perfect. I don't know what happened there, but we're just going to go on. Technically,
okay.
Not.
Okay.
Here's a question that's been here for a few minutes. Does this model require that folks come to the table voluntarily, or have you been able to work this model with a group that maybe is required to come together or feels some obligation to be together? How is that's sort of hard to measure, but throwing it out there, how would you answer that?
Well, I have worked with groups that don't necessarily enjoy one another's company. So right. they have preferred not to work together, but they find some value in choosing to work together. And I've not yet done it with people who are forced or compelled to do it. Sometimes if the circumstance gets bad enough, it's almost like being compelled, like we don't have any other options. We've hit rock bottom in this direction. So, but I've not done it with people who were like under compulsion of some sort.
Sure.
To do it. Yeah.
Sure. Another question here. Thank you for this great presentation, David. This is coming from Megan. Coming from a restorative mindset, I'm wondering how folks move forward without recognizing complicity or accepting responsibility for the roles they may have played or currently play in the problematic or the structures or the systems. Sometimes change happens when we can name and recognize the ways in which we have been complicit in the problem.
Yeah.
I was asking, does that make sense?
It makes plenty of sense. And in fact, the process of having the collective narrative and naming of the problematic, when you've got people who operate in different spheres, they have these moments of recognition where they hear somebody who's generally operating in a different silo from them narrate their experience of a situation that, the party has themselves participated in, they just didn't even recognize. And so there's a lot of recognition that happens, but it's not recognition that requires someone else to identify them as perpetrator or requires them to come to the space as having been wrong or done wrong. They can come to the space having lived their lives, because sometimes it's just on the conveyor unknowingly. If you're on the conveyor belt, like Kamara Phyllis Jones talks about, just living your life on a conveyor belt, going in the direction that has been set up for you, you recognize where you have become complicit. It's also interesting to recognize that complicity isn't just among the people who are on the upside of oppression. Complicity happens on the people who are experiencing and being oppressed, because a lot of times, in order to survive, some of our survival strategies actually become complicit with the oppressive strategies. And so we allow our colleagues at work to tell sexist, racist, misogynist, heterosexist kind of jokes and comments, and we don't call them on it. We don't point out the micro assaults because of the way that economics and employment become a force in shaping our existence. And so sometimes we don't feel that we can challenge it except in a different space. And so we notice that it's complicity that cooperates in shaping that experience. And so everybody gets a chance to notice where and how they are contributing and where they have not necessarily seen relationship with systems. Some people who don't have any need to experience systems don't recognize that those systems are doing work on their behalf. If you've not experienced the violence of the police, then you can recognize the police as being a powerful and positive force, and not ever have heard until you get into these kinds of conversations how it could be otherwise, how the exact same thing that you're looking for positively could be considered otherwise. And so they don't have to become wrongdoers. They just recognize how their performance and their performative way of being is shaping the whole community experience.
That's a good segue into this next question, which is, where do you see empathy in this framework, or is it all the way through it? Or is there particular places where you're evoking empathy?
All the way through it, all the way through. I mean, just hearing the other narratives, listening to mapping, reverse mapping. So I'll give you another example. Working with a community, and there were a number of people in the room, and we were looking for unique outcomes or alternative ways of being, or unique outcomes that could help to shape a counter narrative. And one group talked about the fact that there was a police officer who had told Spanish-speaking individuals when you call the dispatch, don't speak English. Just refuse to speak English, because they were being robbed and oppressed and certain other things. Many of them were undocumented, so had a kind of precarious existence. And they would call to report some kind of violence. What happened was he had created a system where he said, don't speak English, because then they have to transfer you to the only two dispatchers that speak Spanish. And they know which officers are going to call and give honor to your case. And so until we can get full change in the system, we're going to go around the system in certain ways. Now, when other people saw that, they recognized that there are some officers that are actually trying to be resourceful in the ways that they reshape people's experience, a sense of belonging in community, and then they could develop a greater sense of them as people trying to do the best that they could inside of otherwise oppressive systems. And so there are a number of different ways and times where there's the experience of empathy that gets invoked or raised up. It gets called into possibility, but it's never assured.
That's fantastic. David, Ann Gibbons says, can you give a specific example of how this model has been used in a particular community and context? And obviously you have to abbreviate that, but where have you seen this work in an abbreviated or summative example? Well,
the most thorough writing that I've done about it is in the work that we've done in Greensboro. Also done some work in Atlanta, but in Greensboro, we use this work in the kind of looking at the next possible steps after their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and kind of, it had started a process, but there was a certain level of kind of incompleteness. Like, it had made some recommendations, the TRC had made some recommendations, but there was still a lot of room for change, and when we were inquiring about that, that's kind of one of the earliest places where this model was applied. And what we were able to do was to bring together people from a variety of different quarters and sections. Greensboro is like a lot of other northern and southern cities in that it's racially, economically divided, segregated, and so people can do great work and live in very different sections and never know of one another. So bringing them together, having them go and watch a play together, doing some processing around the play, and then coming back and doing a full transformative community conferencing process that produced, and part of the planning included some transitional training for the police, some community engagement where we trained facilitators, police and members of the Movement for Black Lives, and some other folks as facilitators that then go out and co-facilitate other community conversations. And so they have actually, out of this model, created what is called the Greensboro Counter Stories Project. And the Counter Stories Project continues to do work. Right now, they're working in the educational arena using the transformative community conferencing model to begin try to reshape the relationship between education, justice, and community. And so there's a large write-up of that. If you go to Performing Greensboro, if you Google Performing Greensboro, I've written this up in a huge format, but it's a lot more than you want to see about it, but you can see it there, and there's some other places where it's in smaller form.
Fantastic. Matthew Hartman here.
Hey, Matthew, how are you?
Like any process like this, I'm guessing there are likely common missteps that practitioners make in the facilitation process. Who chooses? Oh, I'm sorry, I got the wrong. How did I bounce? Sorry, Matthew, let me get you represented here. Like any process like this, I'm guessing there are likely common missteps that practitioners make in the facilitation or development that can be harmful. Have you identified any particular common missteps in the practice that are particularly problematic?
Yeah, I think there's one, and this is a distinct difference between dialogue and conferencing processes. When we're inviting people together in this kind of analytical way, there's often a time where people get stimulated, re-stimulated. Some of their traumagenic stuff gets triggered in ways that cause people to speak a certain way into community. And often because they've not had the audience, this is one of the things about bringing the people together from a variety of different ways. They've not had the audience with these other voices or other perspectives. So this is the first time they've had a chance to talk to somebody like that. And sometimes when you haven't had the opportunity to talk, the first time when you're doing it, you go in with a certain level of intensity. And in dialogue processes, we manage that a little bit. And sometimes we try to really calm down, like we invite people to speak, but we encourage a certain kind of civility. And we need to open up and so a lot of facilitators who themselves aren't comfortable with emotional expression and the distinctions in the ways that people from different communities like to express, they try to curtail the forms of expression to invite it to be a particular way, to assimilate to a particular model of expression. And that gets to be problematic. That's the kind of squelching and using kind of restorative civility language that creates the politeness that doesn't allow the emotion to be fully expressed. And so how do you manage that? There are ways to manage it so that the full intensity can be there without it necessarily being attacking, and not trying to put it into the kind of container that makes it comfortable for the facilitator. If you're not comfortable with intense emotion, dialogue may be a much better process. This isn't necessarily that, it's not like professional driver on a closed course. You can try this at home. Just know that you want to leave space for people to have different forms. I think that's one of the major missteps. And there are probably some others.
Sure.
And there are probably some that I make that I don't even know, and I need some partners to do this work with who can help point it out to me.
Sure. Coming from Phoebe Kilby, you mentioned in the mapping process that it needs a leader or facilitator. Is this person needed throughout the process? Who chooses the leader? Is the same leader used throughout the process? Does your model give a great deal of power to that person or persons? Just a little bit more on facilitation.
So in the book, I distinguish between conveners and facilitators. There's a convener a group of conveners that are people who are doing the work to get all of the people represented there. And the conveners may be very different than the facilitators. This conferencing model, like most narrative conferencing models, requires a facilitator, because you need to keep people. One of the things is once people start story sharing and things like that, you've got to find ways to manage your time, to keep people on track, to do some other things. And so you want to have someone or some team that's managing those conversations. Now, in terms of the level of power, facilitators always have a certain level of power, and it's one of those things that you have to be self-conscious and aware of, and you're constantly making sure that you're doing the things that a good facilitator does that minimizes the influence that you have by using people's own words and allowing them to fully express, inviting their full descriptions and clarifying in ways that everybody can hear them and those kinds of things. But certainly at the end of the day, if you're facilitating, you always have power, and this process invites facilitators. Now, who gets to choose those facilitators? Who's coming together? Who's convening? That is part of the community process. And so often what you also want to do, because you'll have multiple small community conferencings going on at the simultaneously or in parallel, you get several different people, different perspectives and views and skill sets to all serve as kind of co-facilitators in different settings, which often helps with both the rhythm and the power, like that.
Fantastic, David. I'll try to get a few more in here. You've been really handling the concise answers. We've got some great questions here. Have you found this needs to be repeated or followed up with further conferencing? Or does the group that you've been working with, the community and context, take over on their own?
Well, yes. I mean, what happens at the end of it, you start that planning process. This is the other piece that I think is really, really important about the transformative community conferencing is it's not finished just by naming the dominant narrative, the alternative narratives, and choosing a preferred narrative. Once you've chosen a preferred narrative, then you have to have the ongoing conversations that allow you to shape to plan the nature of relationships. What are the types of relationships and ways of relating that allow us to more habitually move into and operate in this new narrative? You have to have constant conversation around that. What are the resources that are currently being distributed that need to be redistributed, unveiled, reprogrammed, repurposed in order to support this preferred narrative, and how do we go about doing that? And so there's a whole, at the end, the tail end of this process is the beginning of a community organizing model of transformation that then requires some ongoing attention and engagement and a whole nother set of commitments. And it may be that the facilitation gets led by one group, convening is one, facilitation is one, and then a different set of players are doing the organizing and the continuing movement towards and into the preferred narrative. But it's certainly not a once and done, we're finished with it. The power of it is in developing a plan to live into, to create a new habit, for this preferred narrative.
So that would ring with another question here a little bit. I don't know if you want to say anything more. Maybe you've sort of answered that. But how this individual's asking, how do we keep participants in community held accountable to what was decided? How can the behavior doesn't relapse?
So that question about integrity, like one of the points I have, so commitment, looking at relationships, resources, structures, but also integrity. So this idea of integrity, we create what we call integrity meters. Like I give you permission. When you see me in a space, I give you permission to, in some form or fashion, maybe not in a broad public space, but to call me. When you see me acting outside of this narrative, you call me to it. You invite me to do something different. When I'm making decisions that seem like they're not supporting this preferred narrative, call me on it. If you look at the scenario planning process like they did in South Africa and a few other places, there's a really good description of practices for how to invite people into integrity. Like how do we continually invite people into this? And from time to time, like it can be monthly, eventually quarterly, or 3 times, 4 times a year. After a while, we get together and we ask 3 questions. Have we done what we said we were going to do? Are we seeing the results that we expected to see? Does it feel like we're on the right track for shifting the trajectory towards our preferred narrative? Did we do what we say we were going to do? Are we seeing the results that we imagined? Are we on the right track? And that process, did we do what we say we were going to do, allows us the opportunity to hold one another to account and be in integrity. Then we say, that was what we saw before. Are we seeing what we thought we would see? Yes. Does it feel like we're on the right track? Let's keep going. And then we keep doing it. So there's a way it builds in, the planning builds in the accountability and the integrity question as well.
David, I'm going to take one more question here before we need to close up. So I apologize. There's a few more questions here, and I was going in order. It was by no means, I'm trying to leave your questions off, and I apologize for those who had a few questions in. I think we're going to be close on time, but I want to bring us back to a question about Charlottesville, coming from Michelle Wright. She says, I'm coming from Charlottesville. So I'm curious whether you think it is too soon to consider this type of process. There are still a lot of raw nerves right now.
Yes.
Things are too hot, quote unquote, at this point.
Yeah. And I think that's probably right. But one of the things that I've discovered over time in both using this process but other processes is people might be on the same side of the line and be on the same side of the line for very different reasons and be on the same side of the line with very different experiences. And so when I see that picture of Reverend Sekou and Cornell and some of those other folks who are all those clergy who are standing there arm in arm, I know that they're all coming from very different perspectives, and just getting them into their own community conferencing process, you will find out that they're having different experiences, and you can begin the process. You don't have to go across lines right away. I think it probably is still very hot and raw, but there is some hotness and rawness and insecurity that exists even within each of the particular perspectives. And that's a fine place to begin this conversation. You certainly have to come back when you've got, start in the middle with some people maybe on the center right, center left, in the middle of it, some people who are not fully sure, and then you can build out towards the poles and toward the polarity. I don't always go to the far ends first. You can build from the middle of the bell curve.
Thank you, David. This has been fantastic, very engaged, and we really appreciate it. There was some questions left over, like I wish we could have heard the botanical garden story, and
me too. Yeah,
taking you to some other places around the world, which I wished we could have gone to. Some folks asking about resources, and we'll see how we can touch on some of those things by what we put up on the web. Possibly you would have some resource listing around resources in this particular area that you'd want to offer. Thank you very much, David. And I just want to leave with that, and to say that there was many folks who thanked you on the chat or on the question and answer that I didn't say out loud for a very stimulating and provocative conversation, and also useful. I'm going to turn this over now, but just to we'll give our final thanks to you, David, at the end at around 6. But I'm going to turn it over to Kajungu to take us through a few announcements, and then we'll close the webinar. Kajungu.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And my name is Kajungu again, Nturi, and I'm a graduate student at the Center for Justice and Peace Building in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I work as a graduate assistant for the Zehr Institute, and I have a couple announcements to share with you. The Restorative Justice webinar series. For this year, we are focusing on restorative justice and healing historical harms. And the series will focus on how restorative justice approaches can be used to help acknowledge and transform the legacy of slavery and racial injustice in the United States. Webinars take place the third Wednesday of the month, 4:30 to 6 p.m. Please visit our website for more information and registration. Coming, truth-telling on race relations in the U.S. context. This will take place on 18th October 2017 from 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. Our guest will be Thalia, and our host will be Carlo Stauffer. Again, coming to the table, 15th November 2017, the same time, 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. The guest will be Jody Gates. I hope I pronounce her name very well, and also Tom, and also will be hosted by Dr. Howard Zehr. Visit our website for more information and registration. Again, dealing with the past from the theological faith-based practice, this will be 13th December 2017, the same time, 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. Our guests will be Linda Armstrong and Barbara Holly. Our host will be Dr. Carlo Stauffer.
Jungu, can I jump in here real quickly, just back to that, just so that people know the context? We'll be looking at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, which was considered a church of the Confederacy, and they've taken on a 5-year project looking at that historical legacy and how they might want to change that for their current identity as a church in Richmond.
Thank you, Carl. Save the date for upcoming training. The EMU, Eastern American University, will offer training. The topic will be Transformative Community Conference Training, and the instructor will be the same, David Anderson Hooker Doctor. This will be February 16 to Saturday, February 17, 2018, here at Eastern Maryland University. Please visit our website down there for registration and more information. Upcoming STAR, or Strategic for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. STAR Level 1 will be offered January 8 to 12, 2018, just here at EMU. STAR Level 1 will be for February 19 to 23 at EMU. And the STAR, again, Level 1 will be March 5 to 9, 2018 at EMU. Also, STAR Level 2 training will be offered at November 13 to 17, 2017 at EMU. The Restorative Justice Graduate Certificate, it allows you working professional to continue working while completing their studies. That means you can take this program at the same time you can be working at your area. It helps you to reflect on your work and increase your knowledge and the skills. This certificate may be all you need to revitalize your vision and work. For more information, again, there's a website down there you can visit and get more information. Restorative Justice in Education. This is different focus options for K-12 educators, administrators, or other school leaders, community leaders, and the social workers or school counselors. Restorative Justice in Education concentration, students in the Masters in Education group can pursue an interdisciplinary concentration in restorative justice education by taking courses through the Education Department as well as EMU Center for Justice and the Peace Building. The Restorative Justice Education Graduate Certificate is 15 hours graduate certificate in Restorative Justice Education. Learn more through that website, which is indicated at the below there. Masters in the Conflict Transformation and also Center for Justice offer Restorative Justice and Masters in Restorative Justice. Please visit our website for more information and registration. Check out our website for other resources. Maybe I will finish up by saying that the Institute website is available as a source of upcoming events, resources, the schedule for upcoming webinars, and the past webinars you can find on the link on YouTube. The recording for tonight's webinar will be available early next week. That concludes my announcement. So here is Carl for closing comments.
Thank you, Kachungo. And I just want to say on behalf of everyone who's been here, thank you, David, Dr. David Anderson Hooker. I think it would be fair to say you are certainly a critical elder, not in age, but in wisdom in this field. And we appreciate you giving your time and your wisdom and your voice, and appreciate the way in which you're on the edge of some really, really critical practice. And so we want to express our appreciation for sharing that vision with us. It's a hopeful vision. It's an engaged, and it gives, at least for myself, it gives me new insight and hope for what we can accomplish in this field, in this area, and in this country and beyond. So thank you, David.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And we thank all those who stayed and who came through. And we look forward to seeing you again in our October webinar.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Carl.
Have a good evening, folks, and we'll close the webinar at this point.
All righty.